So how did this thing fare on the technical terrain? Did it slip and slide in the mud? Today is all about the Pegasus 36 trail shoe and the third and final test. Let's dive in. Okay guys, so after nearly 100 miles in this shoe, I am finally ready to put together this third and final test for you. So for those of you who are new here and are excited for the video, please do hit that like button, make sure you're subscribed to the channel for weekly running content, and make sure you hit that notification bell button so you don't miss any videos coming out on the channel. So if I wind back the clock a couple of weeks, we bought this shoe and we gave it our first impressions. That went down really well with you, and a lot of you were buying into the hype that I was giving it because I was hyped for this shoe. It's the first ever trail shoe in the Pegasus line, and I've never run in a Pegasus shoe before. So it was really interesting for me to get my foot in a shoe that I've never sort of even been in that range model of shoe, and I have to say, so far, this is my favourite shoe of 2019. Out of all the shoes that I've had so far, this is my favourite. But as always, I like to do things a little bit differently on this channel. I don't just like to give you my first impressions, I like to give my shoes a good testing, just like what we're doing with the Zoom Fly 3 at the moment. We're putting it through its paces, testing it in different types of scenarios, trying to fathom out what I think that shoe is best suited for. And this is no different. We have done the first impressions video, and then of course we've done the speed work video. I wanted to put a good speed workout in this shoe to see if it could handle some good speed work. It passed with flying colours, and then of course see how it felt in a long run. We did 16 miles in this shoe in a long run the following weekend, and again it passed with flying colours. So we come to today's third and final test, which of course, how does it deal with different types of terrain? We're going to cover all of that today and more, so without further ado, let's dive in. I apologise, I know I say let's dive in way too much. If you can think of another catchphrase for me, let me know. So I'm going to break this video down into two sections now. We're going to talk about the types of terrain that I have run in this shoe, and then I'm going to talk about how it fared. So from the beginning, when I got this shoe, I always thought this would be its weak spot, the different types of terrain. So for those of you who have really looked into this shoe, it very much feels like almost like an AstroTurf football boot from an old football player who used to wear lots of AstroTurf trainers. For those of you who don't know what that is, or outside of England, AstroTurf boots are kind of like football boots with moulded studs on, little tiny studs. That's exactly what this feels like. The depth of the lugs is very, very small, but actually, after lots of testing, the lugs are very, very grippy, which is fantastic. And I did think that due to the depth of the lugs that they would struggle on some of the more technical terrain. And so we'll come to that in a minute. So I always thought that this would be the shoe's downfall. So in terms of what type of terrain we have run in, it's predominantly been the flat, buffed out fire roads. That's what we have around here, lots of tracks. But I have been fortunate enough to take it out on some very muddy single tracks, which was the most interesting of the tests, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And of course, in the speed workout video that we did, I did come across a couple of muddy sections, and I purposely ran through those at the time to see how it fared. Not only that, but we've done a couple of runs where we have done some very steep ascent and descent. The video clips in the beginning were just some teasers. We've done some decent runs with some good hills in them. If you follow me on Strava, you'll see I've put some hilly runs on recently, all in the bid to kind of give this thing a good test and make sure that I felt safe and secure in this shoe. We've taken it not only over that, but some rocky terrain as well, so I've made sure that it's felt good going over the rocks rather than just buffed out trails. And the interesting thing that I have found with this in general is that 9 times out of 10, this thing has held up strong. But there have been a couple of occasions when I have felt very unstable in this shoe. I want to dive into that in a second. And I think from that perspective, one of the reasons for that, and it might just be me, but the depth here from the sole of the shoe to the edge of the ankle, when you're going over rocky terrain in particular, I didn't quite feel like my ankle was secure enough. So there was a lot of sort of rocking of the ankle going on. If you have glass ankles like I do, very weak ankles, that can be quite disconcerting. The lacing side of things is brilliant in terms of the fact that I can get it tight on my foot. So there was never a problem with it being loose. And I nailed that down after the first couple of runs. But that's the one downside to the shoe that I'm finding, is that I'm finding if I do take it on just some technical terrain that's a little bit too technical for the shoe, and it's not that it fails on the grip, but it just feels like my ankle isn't quite secure. So I feel very much in my comfort zone on the fire trails, and kind of maybe a little bit more technical. But when it comes to kind of scrambling over rocks and going through the mud and things, there isn't too much ankle support, which can I complain about? Not really. Everything else in the shoe is absolutely great. It just makes me mindful that if I'm running in that type of terrain, to be very careful with where I'm placing my feet, and just to be a little bit more extra vigilant. So that's the type of terrain I've been running, and I really have tried to give it the best as possible. Not only that, but of course I've been running on it in the roads as well. I haven't done pure road runs with it, but I have made purposely sure that I do an 8-mile run, and 6 of those miles on the trails, and a mile out to the trail and a mile back to the trail is on concrete, just to see how it felt, because my last trail shoes were terrible on the concrete, and this thing felt brilliant. I'm not going to recommend it as a road shoe because it's not a road shoe, but I didn't feel like I was running in a trail shoe when I hit the roads. The comfort level of this shoe is through the roof. So in terms of that, I think I've covered every single surface possible. So let me now tell you about how it fared across all of them. Okay, so as expected, the fire roads were perfect. There was absolutely nothing wrong with that. I've done the speed work, I've done the long runs, I've done the majority of my runs across the fire tracks. Absolutely fine. I'm not even going to give that the time of day, because that is probably this shoe's bread and butter type of trail. The mud was a problem. So when the speed work was thrown in, and I noticed there were some mud patches along the way, I purposely went through the mud patches, and a couple of the times my foot completely slid out from underneath me. I mean completely went. Now that's going to be down to the fact that the lugs on this shoe are particularly big. I can imagine if I was in a trail shoe with maybe like a Vibram or Vibram, however you pronounce it, outsole, you're going to get a heck of a lot better grip than something like this. Now ultimately, if you're running through muddy sections and you're on a trail race or a trail run, maybe, I don't know, unless you're an elite athlete, you're not going to be rocketing at 100 miles an hour like I was doing 400 metre repeats upon a fire road trail. But I can safely assure you that half of the time it was okay, and half of the time my foot completely went out from underneath me. And at one point, if I wasn't almost through the gate cycle and my other foot was coming to the ground, I would have completely wiped out. So that was a little bit disconcerting, and from there I took it on more muddy runs. You can probably see it's starting to get nice and dirty, and it wasn't too bad, but that's because I wasn't running at very quick speed. So I think it's more a case of, if you are going to be taking this shoe out for some fast work, make sure that you're not taking out on any sloppy muddy trails, because I don't think that's going to be its strong point. And then of course we move on to the rocky terrain, scrambling up some rocks. So I did a few really steep, probably only like 100 metre sections, so I didn't do it for too long, but 100 metre sections where I'm almost scrambling on my hands and knees at some points and going on my tiptoes up certain paths that are very rocky, very muddy or dusty, with just a sort of buffed out mud. And that surprisingly was really good. So coming down the rocks, sort of sheer rock faces, not completely vertical, but really kind of having to almost scoot down on my backside, this gripped really well. For the size of the lugs, the material on this outsole is super grippy. So that was a big tick, because that's exactly where I thought it was going to have its downfall, was the rocky and more technical terrain. But that of course is where I found the ankle issues, where my ankle was rocking a little bit too much. And again, that's kind of this whole depth thing here. On a road shoe, that depth is pretty standard, and you don't have an issue unless you hit a pothole, because ultimately you're just running in a straight line. On trails, when you're dodging either side, it just felt like they needed to not just take the Pegasus 36, put a couple of extra welded overlays on and chuck a trail sole on, but that's when I felt they needed to do a little bit more in terms of building it up and making it a little bit more stable and secure. Yes, it might have added to the weight, but this thing is super light as it is. Adding an extra ounce on is really not going to have made too much of a difference. So that was my only gripe with the ankle stability, but in terms of how this thing fared on the rocks and that sort of terrain, it was absolutely brilliant. So overall, the only thing that I can fault about it in terms of the terrain is it doesn't do particularly well in the muddy conditions. So there we go, guys, that is it for the testing. Overall, this shoe is absolutely fantastic, and if you remember my reaction to the Nike Zoom Flies, the original versions back in January, me getting at how hyped I was and buzzing that I had been running in Asics for so long and then jumped into a pair of Nikes and was blown away by the difference in technology and how they felt and how incredible that shoe was, you would then understand the magnitude of this when I say that this probably just about pips the Nike original Zoom Fly to the post as my favourite shoe so far of 2019. It is absolutely fantastic, and I'm absolutely loving running in it. Only a couple of minor gripes with it, but on the whole, can't complain. Absolutely brilliant. So there we go. That's it for today, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. Make sure you share it with your friends, and of course subscribe to the channel for weekly running content, and I will see you next time. Until then,